Thank you, Chair. I'm glad to have the opportunity to speak on the issue. But when it comes to housing, the various different rules, regulations and proposals being debated between the Government and the main opposition party are, as the saying goes, like two bald men fighting over a comb. I don't have a great deal of confidence that either side is identifying the root causes. The bill today deals with what I would describe as cosmetic issues, when the crucial issues are more structural and need to be the focus of our attention. The housing situation has been allowed to deteriorate over the last 15 years or so, with a series of poorly designed regulations and government interventions, which in their totality seem to have made the overall problem even worse. The latest plan to award developers grants is yet another white elephant solution. A developer with an apartment in an area where there is expected to be a demand, for instance Cork City, will receive a grant, and yet a developer in Cork County won't. So what's the aim of the policy? Is it to stop developers from going out of business? Is it to ensure that the apartments get completed? Or perhaps it's both? Why then should it matter whereabouts the apartment is located? The fact that the Government have now deemed it necessary to provide such heavy subsidies to the construction of apartments in the areas where there is the greatest demand should be a major wake-up call when it comes to what types of dwellings are being pushed by planning authorities and county councils via the local development plans. If they can be built and sold in the areas with the highest demand without the Government having to subsidise them, then what hope is there for those forced to build high-density dwellings in areas of low or no demand for them? The main cause of the problem are the planning regulations. If a developer wants to build in Wexford, they will be told by the planners that there must be 35 dwellings per hectare, as is soon to be enshrined in the County Development Plan. The demand for those type of units in Wexford Town is very low, and therefore a developer will not take the risk of a major investment under such conditions. Apartments are very costly to build over housing, and if there is no demand, why then would they be built in towns like Wexford? Back in June 2020, I had an exchange with the then Minister for State, Damien English, on the issue of density requirements. I repeat, the issue of minimum density at the edge of town and greenfield sites has caused significant problems outside of the M50 concerning supply of housing. The imposition of such densities necessitates the construction of apartments at locations where they are just not viable. The application of these densities by An Bord Pleanála is unlawful, and it undermines the statutory standing of every county development plan, and no specific minimums have been set out in the specific planning policy requirement, SPPR, or in the ministerial guidelines. After a bit of tooth-pulling, Chair, I eventually managed to extract from the Minister of State a confirmation that there are no minimum density requirements, despite An Bord Pleanála applying minimum densities of their choosing. We're now seeing the executives of county councils being contacted by the regulator. He is also pushing minimum densities, despite the Minister's confirmation that they don't exist. This regulator, a zealot, seems to be a law unto himself. The typology of houses built at higher densities is not what's required. There is no sufficient demand for that type of housing in rural constituencies. Chair, people want family homes with front and back gardens, not ghettos as they will become. Leaving aside for a moment the planning regulations, we also need to look at other government actions and how they've worsened the problem of cost. There are so many government regulations which have resulted in dramatic increases in the cost of housing. Increased transport costs, labour costs, increased carbon tax, the stagnation of our forestry industry for timber due to poor administration, extra regulations on material types, insurance increases, etc., etc., all of which affect the cost of which a builder can construct a house. And that extra cost naturally gets passed on to the buyer. The cause and effect relationship of government decisions does not seem to be given near enough thought. There are a few government supports for first-time buyers, such as the Help to Buy scheme, with its €30,000 maximum grant. But if a first-time buyer wants to ultimately live in a standard house with a bit of space around them like a garden, then why would they waste all their first-time buyer's grant on a small apartment in an area which they don't want to live? It is unattractive for a couple who want to start a family. A recent article in Saturday's Irish Times by Fiona Redden explains why very few people are buying apartments as their forever home. and they are built for the buy-to-rent sector in mind. It's worth a read because she talks to real people. We need to build dwellings that people want in the places where they want to live. It should not be based on a planning regulator going on a personal crusade to enforce his own version of planning laws, and Joe Public or Cork County Council having to take judicial review proceedings to put him back in his box. There are many advantages to living in rural areas, but for so many people the government erect barrier after barrier in their way and instead want to herd everyone into high-density apartment blocks with no transport infrastructure to support them. Many rural government TDs will no doubt live in beautiful rural detached homes set on half an acre, where they raise their families in supportive close-knit communities, with family up the road and lifelong friends next door. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. It is a great way to live, and how many of you would happily swap all of that for a pokey apartment with no garden on the outskirts of your local town? I'd say not a lot of you would be pleased about such a prospect, but yet many of you are happy to impose this Hobson's choice on our young people. And then, when our young people do eventually gather up enough money and meet all of the criteria to qualify for a mortgage, they might then find themselves in competition with the local authority to buy an affordable house. This bill is another example of a focus on the wrong problem. I don't really see the practical problem that this bill would solve. In fact, it may serve to reduce the number of properties available for let in zones which are already under serious pressure. It might be solving a technical administrative problem, but it certainly won't make things any easier for people who are looking for somewhere to live on a short-term basis. This comes back to my point about the two bald men fighting over the comb. It is foolish to continue to regulate when each and every regulation is making the problem worse, because on board Penala think that they're above the law. The officials think they're working within the law, and then the regulator, Mr Cousins, doesn't know the law. The government approach to housing regulations is like Father Ted trying to fix the dent in the car. With his every attempt to solve the problem by tapping at the dent, he is inadvertently making the problem worse until it has gone to such a stage where the car is so broken that it is almost unrecognisable. That analogy, Chair, I think perfectly illustrates the current mess that the housing market is in. We need to stop tapping at the dents of our housing crisis, and instead we need to rethink our whole approach to the issue. Start from the bottom up. Start with planning. There is a major demand for housing. Mostly, when there is a major demand for something, the free market will spur into action and meet that demand. However, the problem we have currently with housing is that the market is not being allowed to operate and is being restrained by government ambiguous legislation, county councils' maladministration and the regulator's own legal interpretations. Start here and stop blaming those who are trying to right the wrongs. Thank you, Chair.